You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com.
You know, over here at Brewlosophy, we're not really ashamed to admit what it is we actually enjoy drinking. We may occasionally share our personal preferences, but we never jump on the haters bandwagon just for the sake of sending some message or, I don't know, looking cool. I mean, who out there doesn't know how much I love Miller Lite, right? I talk about it all the time. Well, a few years ago, a novel product hit the scene that has since become one of the top-selling adult beverages, so popular, in fact, that many craft and home brewers have started making it themselves. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about the types of sugar used to create hard seltzer, yes, alcoholic water, is contributor Andy Carter.
You know, I've not had many of these. I know they've been around for actually quite a while now. But, you know, sometimes it's so hot out, like it is right now in California, that you just want something lighter than light beer. And I think seltzer might fit the bill.
It certainly fits in that domain, in my opinion, right? That it's refreshing, it's light, not only on the palate and flavor wise, but it's also light in terms of calories. And right now there's a big push, you know, in I think the adult world, the big focus right now on being a little bit healthier and trying to prolong this single life we get to live. Since drinking my first White Claw back in, I believe it was 2016, right after the stuff came out, I've become a pretty big fan of hard seltzer. Now, there are certain brands I don't like as much as others, mostly because I tend to perceive this odd earthiness to them, which I've been told is a function of the fermentation process and possibly the type of sugar that's used. We all know that yeast and sugar are what make that fermentation process for us. Well, over the last few years, I've tried a surprising amount of hard seltzers, some made by my friends at home and others that have been made by professionals, craft brewers, and the like. And while I've never brewed one myself, I know you have, Andy, because you sent me some a while back. So I'm looking forward to learning from your experience on that. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for August of 2023 is Brewlosophy's own Will Lovell, who in addition to everything he does for this gig, like performing experiments and talking about them on this podcast, is one of the guys who helped start the Brew Club and continues to serve on the leadership team. We love what Will has brought to Brewlosophy, and I'm sure his session is going to be a fun one. To be a part of it, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than Friday, August 25th, 2023, as Will's going to be taking questions that Saturday the 26th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron and all of the other rewards we offer over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that as well, as it helps those who haven't heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Plus, we really do like knowing what you think. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag home brewing starter kits for very reasonable prices. If you've been considering going electric, though, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Donald Schneider had some feedback on episode 246 where we talked about diluting high OG wort to make a lower strength beer. Donald said, you guys talked mostly about diluting pre-boil and some of the challenges with diluting after that point. However, I did an experiment where I diluted post-fermentation and even post-carbonating per bottle at packaging. I had a Dortmunder in my keg that was basically a Helles but stronger in every way. I crunched the numbers and found that if I was able to dilute that beer by about 22%, then the resulting beer would conform to the BJCP vital stats of a Munich Helles. With a couple competitions coming up, I decided to try to dilute this beer so I could enter the original as a Dortmunder and the dilution as a Helles. This is so up my alley. I love this stuff. One obvious complication is introducing oxygen in the process, so I decided to use some unflavored sparkling water, from the grocery store, thinking that if the water was saturated with CO2, it should prevent introducing oxygen and wouldn't reduce the carbonation of the beer. I used a small funnel with enough tubing to reach the bottom of a bottle, sparkling water, and a third cup, measuring cup, and my beer gun to dilute the Dortmunder as I filled each bottle. That Helles was entered into the Colorado State Fair a couple months ago, and it actually won gold in its category and went on to win Best of Show. Maybe this was a fluke, but it seemed to work pretty good, and this might be another way to get 2 beers out of 1. What do you think, Andy?
This is amazing. Honestly, this is right up my, like you said, right up my alley as well. I think the assumption, so there's a couple things here. So I love the idea of diluting with carbonated water. I was just thinking right now, like, how is it true? So, being saturated with carbon dioxide is one thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean, in my opinion, that it's going to not have oxygen.
Right.
But now I'm thinking about it. I would imagine a savvy water producer, right? They're going to probably boil and cool, or at least flash pasteurize. They're going to do something to the water, put it that way. I would guess that would drive off oxygen. I just don't know how much.
Yeah.
In the end, the only way to know this is to do DO or do some packaging studies to understand it. But I love the idea. I mean, this is fantastic. So cheers to this.
Yeah, I got to say, Donald, I love the way you think. I feel like I can kind of relate, though you are far more clever than me. It would never have crossed my mind to use sparkling water in place of regular water, which I've almost in a weird way, it almost seems safer than taking tap water or something like that. So really cool on that. And honestly, I could just feel the seething of some lager traditionalists out there while reading that feedback. And there's something weird. There's something kind of unique and interesting going on in brewing, or home brewing at least right now, that I've been noticing. We read some feedback a couple episodes ago about somebody who entered a warm fermented, or it was either warm fermented with lager yeast or a Helles that was fermented with Kolsch yeast, which is a big no-no. And they also did really good in a competition. The Brew Club is just slaying. They've got a whole group of guys now who are really interested in just competing, and they just took like 2 gold or multiple golds more than any other club in some competition, and they're all doing weird stuff as well. So it's kind of fun to watch the evolution of this thing. We're not trying to offend anybody, but really what I got to say to you, Donald, is congratulations. That's a hell of an accomplishment. And again, I like the way you think. So if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. If you haven't already, please go subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophy Show with a U. That's not an umlaut. Martin is doing a bang-up job on those videos over there. If you haven't seen them yet, I think you're really going to enjoy them, especially if you already like listening to this type of stuff. So, all right, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on using sucrose or dextrose when making hard seltzer.
After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, The Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what The Hangover can do for you.
Like most, I bottle conditioned the first few batches of beer I brewed, and at the time, I was told only to use dextrose as it would result in minimal flavor impact, unlike other sugars, despite the relatively small amount used for the purposes of carbonation. As I progressed into kegging, sugar was still a topic of discussion when it came to certain higher strength styles, and the same arguments were often made, so it's no surprise that it's also a debated issue when it comes to hard seltzer, where sugar is the sole fermentable. I mean, it's the highest, it's everything that's being fermented, really. Now, before getting started into the different types of sugar and breaking that stuff down, let's spend a minute talking about hard seltzer in general.
Yeah, so if those that don't know what it is, this is a beverage. You've definitely seen it on a shelf if you've been shopping. It's near the beer, wine, cooler area. And technically, legally speaking, it's beer because what happened is there's some laws that changed in the early 2000s in the United States, North America, that allowed sugar, just a product that was made from sugar, to be called beer, which means it falls under the beer manufacturing license type. It's interesting to think about that, but this is a product of legalization, so to speak.
Yeah, is that a U.S. thing or is that a state by state thing?
I think it's U.S. You have to get into it. I did do a deep dive on this many years ago, and it is. But I believe it's like a TTB, thing, right? So it's like they say that. So it's like, if you think about it, just zoom out for a second, alcohol is begotten from yeast, which is sugar-based eating and consumption, right? So there's all these various ways to get sugar or carbohydrates, right? You can get it from fruit. You can get it from plants. Those are the two, right? Fruit plants, some type of vegetable. I'm not going to get into that, fruits or vegetables or whatever, but point being, it's something that grows in the ground, right from the sun. But wine is a fruit based, right? Grapes, orange wine, like orange juice, like from oranges, apple wine, right? Cider. Beer is barley based. So there's this weird thing. What's sugar cane, right? Sugar plant. So it got kind of shoved over into the beer, but that's an aside, but that's the point. That's why you kind of see a lot more now. And I remember when seltzers started, they kind of took a while to catch on. So for the first commercial version was called Spike Seltzer by a guy named Nick Shields in 2013. It has this weird thing, which is like, it's light, right? So it's clear. So it has this thing like sparkling water, which is also caught on, I think, very much so in the last few years or maybe last decade. Health conscious consumers were after something less sweet and lower calorie. So, if you look at alcohol, you look at consumption of alcohol, most of the sugar comes from the alcohol.
Yeah.
Beer has other carbohydrates, things like that, and wine has less, and then seltzer then be the least, right? So you still get carbs from alcohol, but point being, it's the least number of calories.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is, I don't think you can separate the rise in hard seltzer from the rise in popularity of just seltzer water, of sparkling water. I mean, I remember when I moved to Seattle in 1992 to live with my aunt and uncle up there. I've told that story in a past episode. I moved there and my aunt had a carton of Talking Rain in the pantry. And I remember asking her, what in the world is that? That was not something my mom would ever have purchased, right? We were drinking multiple cans, like an ungodly amount of soda when we were kids. And it showed in our waistlines back then. But my aunt had this Talking Rain. She told me, it's something. It's just like a diet water type of drink with very light flavor. And I remember taking a sip, thinking it was god awful. Cut to about 10 years ago, and LaCroix hits the scene. I don't know if anything came before that, but now it's what my kids drink. We all drink the various types of sparkling water. I keep a keg or two of it on tap at my house at all times, so my kids can have that instead of soda. It's just crazy, and that is hugely driven. I think even it's like the subconscious of our culture these days, it's hugely driven by wanting to have a healthier option that's not going to rot your teeth out, cause other health issues. And you can have as much as you want. Now you pair that with people who still want to, get their drink on, as it were. And it makes sense that somebody was going to invent an alcoholic version of water. And man, boy, has it caught on. It's crazy to me. I think you mentioned spiked seltzer. Yeah, that was 2013 when Nick Shields invented it. And I believe he started a company that he called Spiked Seltzer. That was eventually, like 3 years later in 2016, it was acquired by AB InBev, who was buying everything up that it possibly could back then. And they eventually rebranded it as Bon and Vive. So if you've ever had the Bon and Vive hard seltzer, you've had the original Spiked Seltzer, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, so I just did a quick Google search. First year for liqueur is 1981, so it just caught on to popularity recently. So it's water. Spiked seltzer water has been around forever, or a long time. The history of carbonation is fantastic history. Definitely read it sometime. But anyways, we're here to talk about hard seltzer. So
the hard stuff.
White Claw and Truly both hit the market 2016, and by 2018, both brands had become household names. I mean, you ain't breaking laws if you don't have in claws, whatever the phrase is, and just copycats of that were incredibly popular because it was the right time and place. I mean, I was not drinking back then, but Mike's Hard Lemonade and Zima are other products that simulate this, and they came and went. And now we're back to the stalwarts, the White Claw and Truly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really when I was prepping for this episode, I hadn't really thought about the influence of non-beer or wine cooler alcoholic drinks. But yeah, you're right. I was definitely, I've had my fair share of Zima and Mike's Hard Lemonade and stuff like that. And those were kind of the in-between where it was moving away. I mean, I guess they're sort of in the same vein as your Bartles and James and such, but the more fruity, the sweeter, not as bitter. But White Claw and Truly and all of these other hard seltzers, they just take it to a completely different level where it's not sweet. It really does satiate that thirst while also getting you a decent buzz, I guess. And it's fascinating to me that this stuff became as popular as it is, and even more so that I kind of like it. I mean, I really like some brands that I've had, and so it's just a really neat thing. Now, if you're out there and you're anti, big corporation drinker, which we totally respect as much as we might disagree with you, there are some craft outfits who are making hard seltzers. The first craft hard seltzer I ever had, I was up in Yakima, I believe it was 2017 or 18. So not too long after White Claw really became a big thing. And I was given I believe it was a Fuji Apple San Juan seltzer. And this stuff was phenomenal. I told my wife about it, and she ended up going on a trip up there to meet with one of our old friends, and she had some and agreed that it's phenomenal. They make really great flavors, and every time we go up there, we'll be heading up next week, we always grab a 12-pack of San Juan seltzers or whatever. Oscar Blues, everybody knows that name for their various delicious beer offerings. They have their Wild Basin, which is a hard seltzer. They're out of Longmont, Colorado, and even me locally here, I don't know about you, Andy, but right here in Fresno, Crone Wolf Brewing has a variety of different seltzers. Now I put those in air quotes. I'm sure you tried them actually last time you were up here.
Yeah.
I put those in air quotes because they are not your typical clear seltzer. They are made with various fruit purees and such, but it's still different. It's just water and fruit puree instead of sugar, or dextrose or sucrose, as it were. And that's how they're getting the majority of their fermentables. But it's become a real thing, and they are making a massive amount of money right now, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've said, I've been on other podcasts, other times, that there's a diversification you require for every business if you see sales lagging, and for breweries, if you're not opposed to it morally, there's other things people can drink that can be made on your license type. You don't need to have a different license to have outside beer. You don't need to have a different license to make a cider or some other weird alternating proprietorship. You can just make a seltzer, and then you can have your art speak through that seltzer. There's plenty of space to occupy there.
Yeah, and actually, correction, I'm not even sure that Krohn Wolf is doing that they're doing fermented fruit juices. I think they are actually making a base, but then they doctor it up with these flavorings.
Yeah.
And I the only reason I say I make that correction is because Brad, the head brewer, has given me some of the samples of these like extracts that he uses for the flavorings for his seltzers, and we use them here at my house for sparkling water for the kids. It's great stuff. I wish somebody out there would make homebrew size versions of this, but I reached out to the two companies that gave Brad the samples, and they don't. They only sell them in bulk. So I don't know. Maybe More Beer will do something with that. It seems to be getting popular enough. But
I'll say Amaretti's a great source for sterile fruit puree that's at homebrew size. So check them out. No plugs there. Just go check them out.
Yeah, they're not a sponsor of us, but we've all used their stuff before. You've probably even seen it at a couple pubs if you go out often enough to unique breweries. So, well, like I mentioned earlier, I've never made a hard seltzer, but this stuff is not crazy complicated as far as I can tell. There's just a few ingredients. Now we're gonna go over brewing. I guess I'm not sure that's what it's called. Making hard seltzer in sort of a detailed way. There are various approaches to doing it. I know I've talked to quite a few people who have given it a shot. There are some people who have had tremendous results, others who've had tremendously awful results. So I think some things you really got to keep in mind if you want to make a clean, neutral hard seltzer base is obviously it makes up the majority of most things that we drink is the water quality of the water that you're using to make the hard seltzer. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I would probably first off be sticking with, it's a hard water, right? Get the cleanest RO water or maybe even distilled water that you can. But I'm not sure what I would do mineral profile wise for making one of these.
I mean, if we're going by the back of the envelope, or not the back of the envelope, but going by what you would think, I think you want a softer, like you don't want a soft mouth feeling. You want to accentuate sweetness. I don't think you want more bitterness in this thing. I would say light to chloride, but that's just my beer knowledge influencing.
Yeah.
To be fair to seltzer waters, mineral water, sparkling mineral water has quite a bit of some type of minerality to it. So it might add something interesting. But it shouldn't be something you should really worry too much about. I think you want enough. I would think the minimum you want is like the minimum levels that you say for yeast health.
Yeah.
Because this is a special kind of fermentation, which we'll get into later, but
well, and in speaking of yeast health, that's going to be about 50 ppm or more. I have 50 to 150 ppm of calcium, and however you get that, whether it's calcium chloride or calcium sulfate, also known as gypsum. I would probably go, in my thinking about this, I would probably just aim for a neutral mineral profile or sulfate to chloride ratio of about 1:1. Each of those being around the 50 to 75 mark would be, because I like that minerality in my water. You don't think you'd perceive it, but then you drink RO water next to a batch that's been mineralized. And you get a nice, I don't know, I like it better. You get a nice little sharpness out of it. Same way it does with beer, right? Now, one thing you definitely don't want in that water, especially because you're going to be throwing yeast in this stuff, is chloramines, chlorine, stuff like that. So if you are using filtered tap water or tap water in general, get some Campden or sodium metabisulfite, potassium metabisulfite, and just treat your water right before maybe 10 minutes before making your seltzer with it to knock any of that stuff out, so that you don't have to worry about it, contaminate or not contaminating, but really ruining this stuff that you're putting very little work into making in the first place.
So obviously the next most important thing is sugar, but we're going to get into those details in a minute. So let's move on to the nutrient. So like any type of beer or any type of fermented product with yeast health is really important. And we always make starters or do a whole pack from imperial yeast. But nutrients, unlike beer, and much more like grape fermentations, you need to really think about your nutrient types. And so usually, I don't know about you, Marshall, but I'll get stuff from Y Yeast or these little tabs, or from White Labs that have little yeast packets. But now, because of the rise of seltzer-based or water-based hard beverages, companies are now selling purpose-built yeast packets for seltzers.
Yeah, that's an interesting development. But I think the reason they do that is because it's not very difficult to do. It's probably mostly the same nutrients. I mean, you've got zinc, you've got, your dead yeast cells, all that stuff. What I've been seeing, I just did a real cursory look online of, what other people are using. And a lot of people are using the imperial yeast nutrient or the Y yeast nutrient, just your general brewing nutrient. I think the key when it comes to yeast nutrient when making hard seltzer, the key to remember is that you are not adding any nutrients to this water through natural ingredients, right?
Exactly.
We know malt adds various nutrients, your fan, some zinc, all of that stuff. You're not getting anything. So it's best. I mean, will yeast do their thing? They're going to work. Do you want to make this environment as inviting for them as possible? Absolutely, because the last thing you want is to create, this hard seltzer that's not as clean as it could have been. We've all, at least I have had those types of hard seltzers, and those are the ones that I avoid. I don't want to taste yeast character in a hard seltzer. I want it to taste like water or flavored sparkling water that just also happens to get me a little bit buzzed. So pick out your favorite yeast nutrient. Do your research on that one. What I've seen most, like I said, is your standard, Fermaid type based yeast nutrients, and I have a feeling that those are probably going to work fine. If you're really nut about fermentation, you can figure out what you need to use, but you probably already know if you're that big into it. So obviously, the next thing you got to do, you've mixed your water, your sugar, and your nutrient. You got to add some yeast to this. I've seen a lot of, I want to call it controversy, but a lot of talk and debate about what yeasts work best for this, from wine yeast to, cider yeast, which again are just usually wine yeast that have been repurposed for cider that happen to work well with it, to people who swear by using things like Flagship, the Chico strain. What kind of thought are you, I mean, we are no experts on hard water, but what thoughts are you putting into yeast selection for this type of a drink?
I think it's interesting because in my mind, just how I think about yeast, if you're looking at beer yeast, right, really well cultivated for fermentation of alcohol, relatively neutral flavor profile. Wine yeast is separated by that. It really doesn't eat maltose, right? It doesn't have the same enzymes, but in general, it still does the same thing. Other beer yeast, other yeast in general, make different flavors. So really, to me, as long as the nutrient profile is correct, and that's really borrowing from the wine world, in my opinion, then I think really it would be dope is to try other yeasts that are not clean. Belgian yeast, Belgian seltzer, other weird thiolized things. That's where the experimentation comes in. That's when I say this is a new frontier, blue ocean, is that I don't see people trying other yeasts to add new flavors to these beverages. That's kind of what I think. And I don't know if it's going to work or not. I'm just speculating. But I see it really just open-ended. If you want just a neutral profile, just do a lager yeast or something. Just do something where there's like absolutely devoid of all flavor and try that.
Well, that's the thing, though, is I can't help but wonder if what we consider, neutral in beer is in part because we have come to expect that as being neutral. So this is your mileage may vary type of a situation. There are definitely yeast strains out there that have been shown to be very clean. I know that Imperial has a specific, hard seltzer yeast. I believe it's called Paramount. But there are other ones as well. And I've heard good things about like the Weihenstephaner lager strain. That's Imperial's Global, or I believe it's WLP 830 from White Labs. But try that out. A big thing that I've been hearing though is so the characteristic that I don't like in hard water, and truly, unfortunately, seems to have this characteristic, is this kind of earthy, dirty, yeasty thing. And a lot of people that I'm drinking with, we'll sample each other's and they're saying, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't get it. I definitely get it. And it's just not my favorite. I'll drink through it. I don't care, but I would prefer to not have that there. And one way that I've heard that homebrewers especially are getting away with removing any of that fermentation character to their beer is through filtration. And one common means of doing that is by adding activated charcoal to the fermented hard seltzer, which I think is really cool. It's not something you hear of very often in homebrewing, but apparently it absorbs that, somehow like absorbs those characteristics and pulls them out, and also helps to clarify the water as well. So that you could do that. You could do mechanical filtration, of course, run it through a plate filter or something like that, and trying to get that water as it is, as clean as possible. So, all right, now let's do this. Let's spend the final part of this segment breaking down the actual topic of this episode, which is the types of sugar used to ferment to make these hard seltzers. And I would say that one of the more common ones you're going to see in recipes online is dextrose. What is dextrose, Andy?
So dextrose, of the saccharides, a monosaccharide made from corn and sometimes wheat or other vegetables. It's also biochemically identical to glucose. So if you're similar, it's monosaccharides, right? Small chains of sugars. It's about 30% less sweet than table sugar. Very fermentable. I think we've all understood this. You add dextrose at bottling, it dissolves easy. It carbonates the beer quickly. It's purported to produce a very neutral profile when fermented. So,
yeah. One of the things I've often wondered is how in the world did brewers settle on using dextrose for bottle conditioning? I mean, why didn't you use other things? I always convinced myself it was because dextrose is so neutral when it's fermented. It's so highly fermentable. It is 30% less sweet than sugar, which means that it would, it's contributing less fermentables overall when used pound for pound. So you have to use more dextrose than sucrose, I believe. And so it's just kind of interesting to me. It is a monosaccharide, and you said, so that's a single molecule that's typically made from corn. But yeah, it's just interesting to me how that became the sugar that brewers use.
To me, in all my experience, I had to count recently. It's been 14 years of brewing. I think it's because it dissolves so easily in water. I think it's just because it's so dissolvable.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That's kind of where my mind went as well. When you're blending you're making your priming sugar solution, and you don't have to wait as long for the sugar to be in there. But regardless, sucrose, which is just table sugar, came to kind of develop this bad reputation. I remember as recent as the last 10 years, podcasters and people on different forums and such saying definitely stay away from sucrose, table sugar, for bottle conditioning, or if you're trying to just increase the strength of your beer, because it's going to leave this appley character in your beer. You're going to be able to taste it. Nobody wants that. I never noticed it when I cheated and used sucrose, but hey, I hadn't done a side by side yet. Now, just to describe sucrose a little bit, it's a disaccharide, so it's composed of a glucose and a fructose molecule that are bonded together, and the sugar typically comes from sugar cane or beets. I think most people know that. For some reason, sugarcane sugar is more expensive than beet sugar, but they are basically the same. They are both sucrose, and I can't taste the difference in side-by-side comparisons when I'm eating just the sugar. So similar to dextrose, it is very highly fermentable. Almost 100%, if not 100%, of sucrose will ferment out. In the same way, you don't need to use as much sucrose as you do dextrose to achieve the same strength, but it's purported to produce this kind of faint but noticeable apple-like character when it's fermented, which is why people recommend avoiding it. Have you ever picked that up or thought that you picked that up have you ever even used sucrose, Andy?
Oh, I think maybe once or twice in a very emergency thing. And I think then when I'm bottle conditioning, I don't know about you, but when I'm bottle conditioning, it's such a beer that has things going on like sours or big stouts that if I could taste a difference, I would be shocked.
Yeah.
Just there's so many other things going on. I think in the end, if I really want to break down what I think is going on between the two, just on paper, I think it's just dextrose is such a more refined product, and sucrose has got just more things in it. Like I think there's like other like trace elements because it's or organic or something like that, where dextrose is a little more engineered product. And so I think there's just like a cleanliness issue of like what else is in it other than the sugar. And that's the flavor that people get. But I could be wrong. I think it's just when I look at it side by side.
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. There's a lot of claims in brewing that I've come to just scratch my head about. We'll say it that way. Now, I've never made my own hard seltzer, as I said before, but I've used a fairly decent amount of both of these sugars when brewing certain styles of beer. And I'll admit, I was swayed by the stuff that I read online or heard on podcasts. So up until just a few years ago, I only used dextrose in my brewery. When I finally mustered that courage to use table sugar instead because I was out of dextrose and had a bunch of CNH at my place, the beer tasted no different than the ones that I'd made with dextrose, at least in my own thinking. These were not side-by-side comparisons. Now, of course, the total amount of sugar for a batch of double IPA or Belgian triple is pretty low, and it can be argued that other aspects of those beers overshadow what impact on flavor the sugar had. Such is not the case with hard seltzer, where sugar makes up 100% of the fermentables, making it a perfect place to kind of, I guess, flesh this debate out. Does sucrose and dextrose really, impart different characteristics? So we were curious to see how a batch made with dextrose compares to one made with sucrose, and we put it to the test. We're going to be back with those results right after these messages.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
When I realized using table sugar when making certain beer styles really is no different than using dextrose, I was thrilled because, well, for one, we always have sugar on hand at home, but it's also a little bit cheaper and just easier to come by than dextrose. Now, seeing as hard seltzer is just fermented sugar water, it made sense to me that the type of sugar used might have a perceptible impact, a noticeably perceptible impact at that. A couple years ago, contributor Phil Rusher designed an experiment to flesh things out a bit.
Yeah, so Phil looked at just the difference in sugars. So we start with 2 5-gallon batches of hard seltzer. He got 2 identical volumes of water in separate clawhammer 240-volt electric kettles. And to pick his water profile, as we were kind of alluding to before, Phil targeted that of San Pellegrino sparkling water.
I've done this before, Andy. I actually one of the first or second batches of just sparkling water I made at home, I also targeted the San, because they put it right on their bottle. So I was like, oh yeah, I like San Pellegrino. Yeah. I'll try it out. The water was great. I'm not sure it tasted much different than anything else I'd made. But hey, yeah, a good idea from Phil, I thought.
Good starting point, at least. I mean, that's an educated starting point. So he boiled the water before adding the sugar. So as we mentioned, there's slight differences in the chemical compounds, and therefore there's slight differences in the points per pound per gallon, or PPG. So 3 pounds and 5 ounces or 1.5 kilograms of sucrose is equivalent to 4 pounds or 1.8 kilograms of dextrose. Sucrose yielding 46 points per gallon, points per pound per gallon, or PPG, while dextrose yields about 42 PPG.
Yeah, and this is one of those things that we have to take into account when we're designing experiments. There are times where we'll design an experiment, and if we choose, for example, on this one to say, okay, let's just use 4 pounds of either, and in the end, the difference in OG and ultimate, alcohol level will be a function of the variable. I don't think that's fair when we're comparing these two things specifically, and one is known to be about 30% sweeter than the other. So I think Phil made a really solid decision here. The goal being to aim for the same exact alcohol level and strength. So yeah, solid call there. In my opinion, you might disagree, Andy.
Yeah, no, I think I agree, because in the end, Brewlosophy is about standardizations and replications of experiments, and then keeping things the same, exchanging one thing. We agree in almost every batch of beer to keep the OGs the same. Even the data has showed us time and time again, slight differences in OGs and FGs, ranging in the same recipe otherwise, don't seem to have a noticeable effect in the significance or insignificance. So we're just going to keep doing it the same way. I can explain it to someone. It's easy to explain it. Why not do it that way?
Yeah, exactly. So this so far is a very difficult brew day, as you can tell. Phil went on to boil each of these waters or sugar waters for 10 minutes just to ensure that they had no contaminants in them at all, because he was going to be fermenting. And so he boiled them for 10 minutes and then racked them chilled them and then racked equal volumes to separate fermenters. And that was it. Both were and God, good call. The calculators worked in Phil's favor. Both of these waters were at 6.4 degrees Plato, which is 1025 OG. I just love that they were at the same exact OG. I mean, that makes me, the scientist in me, feel really good,
Math is powerful.
Yeah, sure
don't
is.
ignore it. Yeah. So after they were chilled, they were dosed with the same amount of Y yeast nutrient, and then poured a pouch of Imperial yeast, WL4 or Paramount, into each batch. This is a specialized wine strain that ferments very clean, producing very low fusel alcohol. So I think also gaming the yeast here, and I think that was a smart choice.
Yeah, so do I. I've had one cider that I'm aware of that was fermented with Paramount, and it is the closest a homebrewed, or not cider, a seltzer. It's the closest a homebrewed seltzer that I've had comes to that clean White Claw character that I like. The yeast just should get in there and get the heck out of the way. So it really is a very clean fermenting yeast, even when it's just fermenting dextrose or sucrose. So pretty cool stuff. Good choice on yeast there.
Yep. So then he fermented at 75 Fahrenheit or 24 C for a week before upping it to 80 Fahrenheit or 27 Celsius. With science fermentation absent for another week, Phil cold crashed the seltzers to 38 Fahrenheit or 3C, and then added 10 grams of activated charcoal to each batch per the recommendation of Brees. This is intended to pull out any remnant fermentation characteristics and maybe add with clarity, but I'd want to. What do you think, Marshall? Is it going to clear it up?
I think it does. This is another one. So the website that Phil linked in this article to Brees's talk about the activated charcoal for hard seltzer is no longer there. So it may have been that they just changed the web address or something like that. I don't know. But the one that we linked to is no longer available. But I remember reading it a couple years ago, and activated charcoal is kind of known for cleaning things up. Why wouldn't that help with clarity as well? I've seen quite a few. I've heard people say that when they added activated charcoal, their water turned black and stayed black and it wouldn't drop out. I have to believe that's a function of being unable to cold crash or something, because it is a solid that will fall out, especially if it's in a cold environment. I've already seen the waters that Phil made, and we will just say that they are crystal clear. So I think it's a great idea. I ended up buying some activated charcoal for use in whenever I get around to making a hard seltzer myself. So.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So 18 hours later, hydrometer measurements showed both waters were at the same 0.997 finishing gravity, leading us with a 3.7% ABV seltzer. So that's actually even lighter than most commercial seltzers. Most commercial seltzers sit around 5%. So this is a light seltzer.
Hey, but I'll tell you, 3.7%, that's good.
I would rather have that than 5. But that's
you drink a lot of those bad boys and not get in any trouble. Yeah. And it's just water. So hey, what I love is that not only did these start at the same OG, but they both finished at the same FG and ultimately had the same alcohol. So again, Phil's planning really came into play here, and it seemed to work out. So
Well, and that's actually that's the rarity, I would say, of experiments where they hit the same numbers exactly, right?
Exactly,
this is actually kind of pretty impressive, so this is cool. So seltzers were pressure transferred into sanitized serving kegs. They were placed in a kegerator and burst carbonated before the gas was reduced to serving pressure. After a few days of conditioning, they were ready for evaluation. We'll note that Phil left these seltzers unflavored in order not to hide any differences caused by the type of sugar that was used.
So that right there is the sign of a true scientist. He taken one for the team by not adding flavorings. The only unflavored seltzer I've ever had, hard seltzer, is the ones that you sent me, Andy. I think you sent me one unflavored and then one that had some flavor in it. But definitely the unflavored one was not something that I would want to sit around and drink all the time. I like the fruit flavors. I like mango. I like that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like when they balance each other out, this alcohol, acidity, and fruit together is a real winning combination. So
sure is
for me. Objective observations. Marshall alluded to how these looked. Tell us again, Marshall.
Absolutely crystal clear. They both looked identical, which already there's again some objective evidence that it's not a big deal, but sucrose and dextrose don't seem to have an impact on the way things look. It didn't. There was no difference in haze. There was no difference in color. These just looked like bubbly waters, to my eyes at least.
Yeah. So this is a throwback episode. So this is COVID-19. We don't have a traditional triangle tests. This was all done by Phil. Marshall, could you remind us how we do that experiment during COVID-19?
Yeah, got it. I'm so glad we're so past this and we haven't talked about it in so long. But basically, during the COVID stuff, when we weren't going out and serving beers to blind participants, in order to keep the experiment series running, as people asked us to do, we developed this kind of COVID protocol wherein we would do 10 semi-blind triangle tests ourselves, all of which were served to us by somebody else, so that we were, like I said, semi-blind. We knew what the variable was, but we were completely unaware of what, which beer, I guess, but which hard seltzer is in which glass, anything like that. And then we would do those triangle tests and mark down how many times we got it right or wrong. And so out of the 10 trials that Phil did, he would have had to have chosen the unique sample 7 of those times. And in the end, out of 10 trials, he chose it just 2 times. So 20% of the time, which is not significant, obviously. And Phil, despite knowing everything about these hard seltzers, despite knowing that one of them used more dextrose than the other used sucrose, all of that stuff, he had to admit that there was nothing different about these hard seltzers, which I feel is incredibly revealing. I don't know I mean, if like what you were saying earlier, that there's maybe some trace minerals or whatever in sucrose and table sugar, then if that's the case, then I would have to believe, based on these results, that maybe it's just some types of table sugar, and that the ones that were purportedly imparting this apple character in other people's beers may have been just that one brand or something. I don't know, because if you're going to taste the difference, this is where you're going to taste it, between those two. So to me, the implications here stretch far beyond hard seltzer, though I do think it's great to know that somebody can just go make some hard seltzer out of the sugar that's in their cabinet,
Yeah, and I think this is important data. Like you said, again, it breaks that, it breaks at least, or not breaks, gives a little bit of credence to maybe these sugars are more similar than they're not. If the old story that the different sugars will taste different in the bottle, that's really not as much. Where we could have seen differences if they were stronger, maybe there would be more fermentation byproduct that would drive those flavors. But in the end, I would say, just like a lot of things where we've discovered, if we follow all the right rules, right, the nutrient, the yeast pitch, we're going to eliminate yeast strain as a variable.
Yeah.
Right. So flavor, like we've said, so much of beer's flavor comes from yeast, and then everything else after that. If it was a small thing, we've maximized the yeast's potential in this case to ferment cleanly. The small differences in the sugars should stand out. So I think this is great. I mean, this is not only is it obviously open up opportunities by taking the data and taking it and saying, hey, I could ferment other things. I think it also opens up the idea, well, okay, let's push the boundary, right? Let's go to brown sugar. Let's go to other sugars that you have, and what do those do? Because you can. I mean, it may be hard for someone to tease out dextrose versus glucose versus sucrose in a blind, just tasting it, right? Other than the sweetness, but you can definitely smell brown sugar smells different, right? Other interesting sugars smell different. So what do those do, and where are those going, and how could you make a cool, tasty beverage from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the bigger implication is I don't need to feel guilty if I'm making a double IPA and I add 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds of table sugar. My guess is, I guess we should do this. Maybe we already have an experiment out there where we compared dextrose and sucrose in beer, but I just don't think it's going to be a meaningful difference. I really don't. And I feel like this is one of those areas where I will say I think people got some wrong information somewhere, and you can get away with using sucrose or dextrose, whatever you want. And, in my opinion, I'm going with whatever's the most convenient or cheapest, because I think that's just the way to approach it, the way that I would want to approach it. So now I would be interested. This is just an idea that came to me. You're going to think I'm a genius here, but what if you, honey is sugar. What if you took honey and blended that with water and ferment? Wait.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Wait, hold on.
Wait. Obviously I'm making a joke, but you think about it, that is how these things get started. People are like, wait, it's sugary. Yeast will eat it and produce alcohol in the end. Let's try fermenting it. And I feel like one of the interesting things about hard seltzer, as clean and as neutral as these tend to be, is, you can make a boozy drink out of pretty much anything that's sugary. And like you said, brown sugar, that could be nasty. It could also be really cool, something nobody's ever done, So, the world is our oyster, as it were. So, well, that is all the time we've got for this episode. Andy, do you have any final comments on the sugars used to produce hard seltzers?
No, I think this is a great baseline for people that want a good recipe. You could see that there's two differences in sugar and how to implement either, and just use this as a springboard for the next thing. Play with different ingredients, try with hops, try with other fruit purees, and tell us what you think. And maybe you find where there's a difference in your experiments if you try them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, what I'd be curious to see is, what's the difference? What kind of impact does fermentation temperature when using various types of yeast have when you're making hard seltzer? There's just so many things that we can look into. And what if we discover that, wow, when you ferment with this type of yeast at this temperature, it produces these really neat, naturally fruity characteristics, stuff like that. I don't know. I think that's kind of the new frontier you were talking about, and I'm excited to see where we go with it. So, well, don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah.